High Priest and Melchizedek. Who are they, and why is it important for you to understand as a believer and follower of Yeshua? We're going to talk about that today in this video. I believe the author of Hebrews is very skilled in drawing these parallels and drawing these compares and contrasts, putting the superiority and inferiority of a thing right before his readers to set up his point. And he did that in chapters 1 and 2 when he was talking about the divinity and humanity of Christ. He did that in chapter 3 where he was talking about the superior message that Christ brought versus Moses, and he's doing that again in chapters 5 and chapter 7 of Hebrews. Now remember, he started to talk about the high priest in chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, but then took a sidebar between chapters 5 and 6, or in chapters 5 and 6, to first rebuke his believers for being too lazy to understand the higher things of God, because they had to continue to focus on the elementary doctrines. And if you have not listened to that study yet, go back and listen to that. I'll link the card right here. And then he exhorted his audience to continue to grow spiritually and grow in their knowledge, and then to grow in their faith and obedience. And then he picks back up in chapter 7 with his speaking of Melchizedek. But before we do that, let's look at chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, and talk about what the high priest is and what his role is and why it's important for you to understand that. All right. We won't read every verse verbatim, but I'll give you a summary of the sections that we're going to talk about. So Hebrews 5, 1 through 5, he's talking about who the high priest is and why they come from. He says they're appointed by God through men, and that they go and offer sacrifices for the sins of the men that they lead to God in the tabernacle on the altar. He says that he's able to help them in their ignorance. He's able to help them in their weakness and when they go astray. And he also has to offer these same sacrifices for his own sins, because he's clothed in that same weakness and in that same flesh. And he says that no man takes this honor to become priest and takes this honor to do so on themselves, but they're appointed by God in the same way that Aaron was appointed by God, right? Remember, in the Old Testament, the Levitical priesthood is by law and lineage. God appointed it to be that way. They didn't just choose, hey, all Levites are going to be priests. God chose it that way. And in the same way, Christ did not take that glory on himself to become high priest, but it was appointed by the one who said, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." Then we go to verses 7 through 10, where he talks about Christ walking in that priesthood and walking in his flesh. And again, I'll summarize it. He basically says he was offering prayers and supplications for himself and for man. And he had to go through the suffering so that he can learn obedience. And through that suffering and through that obedience, he was perfected. And in his perfection, he then became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, right? So we'll break that part down. This is in verse 9. He says, eternal salvation, meaning that salvation that comes will not cease, right? It's not for a specific time period. He says for all, which means it's not just for specific people. And he says who obey him, right? Obedience is part of the recipe in order for you to walk through salvation. Your faith is evident by your works. You can't just say, I believe. It has to be with your works, right? And he finishes in verse 10 by saying that he was called as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek by God. So who is Melchizedek then, right? So he set up who's a high priest. Now he introduces the order of Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? We only see Melchizedek twice in the Old Testament, and the first time we see him is in Genesis 14, 18 through 20. This is after Abram has defeated the other kings and their armies. He says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram, God of Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and gave him a tithe of all. So Abram tithed to Melchizedek. As we understand in the Old Testament, they would tithe to the priest. Abram, before that law, before that lineage came out, gave a tithe to this man who is a priest according to God. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about who this Melchizedek that Abram just tied to. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, he's basically setting up who Melchizedek is believed to be. First of all, he's without genealogy, right? He's without father or mother, nor beginning or end. The scriptures don't talk about either one of those, right? Then he says, his name means the king of righteousness. And since he was the king of Salem, he's also the king of peace. And if you haven't yet drawn the parallel, we look at, he's giving him an eternal nature by saying he's without genealogy, without father or mother, without beginning or end. He's pointing out his name meaning the king of righteousness, and he's pointing out him being the king of peace. He's giving him these divine attributes. If we look back at Hebrews chapter 1, when the Father is speaking to the Son, what attributes did he give to the Son? We understand when we read through the Old Testament, we see these types or these shadows of Christ, right? Not that these are Christ incarnate, but these shadows or foreshadows of who Christ is going to be to his people. And in this way, we see one of the ways Christ is going to be the high priest who is appointed by the order of God and not by the lineage of man and by flesh. So I wanted to point that out because he's drawn one parallel there. And he continues in chapter 7 to go on and speak about the superiority of Melchizedek to Abram when he says how the superior blesses the inferior, and so also the inferior tithe to the superior. Abram tithed to Melchizedek. Melchizedek gave him a blessing. And he's saying, and in such, so too did the lineage of Abraham also tithe to Melchizedek, which then too makes them superior. He continues on in chapter 11 or verse 11 of chapter 7 to start talking about the superiority of the priesthood itself, saying that if perfection had come through the Levitical priesthood, meaning that of the lineage of the Levites, then what would there have been a reason to have a priesthood in the order of Melchizedek? He says that Christ was not from the line of the Levites, but from the line of Judah, and that Moses didn't mention anything in the law about priests coming from this line. And because of this, it makes more sense that there needs to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek makes more sense because this priesthood doesn't come from a legal regulation about the physical descent of your lineage, but it's about indestructible life. And then he goes on to talk about how God testified and swore that Christ is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And because of this indestructible life that Christ has when he died and rose again, and the oath that God made to make him a priest forever, Christ remains and is therefore able to save completely all those who come to God through him, since he also lives to intercede for them. So he's setting this up to not only talk about the superiority of Melchizedek's priesthood to that of the Levitical priesthood, but also the covenant that Christ brought to that of the one that Moses brought in, right? Then he continues 26 through 28 to say the type of priest we need in God. He says, for this is the kind of high priest we need, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day as high priests do for their own sins, then for those for the people. He did this once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the promise of the oath which came after the law appoints a son who has been perfected forever. Okay, a brief summary on all of that. We need to first understand what a priest is. The priest is someone who is appointed by God to be the mediator between man and God, in order to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. This way, they can now be counted righteous before God and realize his eternal salvation. This priest must also atone for themselves, and that priesthood in the Levitical law was by physical descent. Then we look at the priesthood of Melchizedek. He was a priest forever because God appointed him that way outside of the lineage of the law. Because of this, Christ now has that priesthood. Christ has that priesthood because he was appointed not by lineage, but by the word of God, and he was promised. So Christ is now our mediator. 26 through 28 tells us the type of priest we need and the type of priest that Christ is. If you need more understanding and you want to read it in depth, you can go to the Levitical law, open up Leviticus, you can read about the priesthood, you can read about what the law says, and then we will talk about why we need to understand the need for a mediator, the need for a priest and a high priest in the next video when we talk about chapters 8 through 10 and the new covenant. Until next time, I hope this blesses you. Let's look to advance the kingdom in our lives and that of the ones that we touch.